Hey guys, tonight we begin with something far more dangerous than war, plague, or invading armies in medieval times: dinner. So before you get comfortable, take a moment. Like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In medieval Europe, food was never neutral. It wasn't just calories on a plate, it was a character test. Every meal came with the unspoken feeling that someone, possibly God, possibly your local priest, possibly both, was watching you chew and quietly judging your enthusiasm. Eat too eagerly, and congratulations, you've revealed something deeply troubling about your soul. Eating was considered a moral activity, not because food was dangerous, but because it was effective. It kept people alive. It made cold days tolerable, and worst of all, it occasionally made people happy. Naturally, medieval thinkers found this alarming. The medieval worldview assumed the body and soul were locked in an eternal disagreement. The soul wanted discipline, restraint, and eternal glory. The body wanted warmth, comfort, and another spoonful of stew. Every meal was basically a tiny theological debate played out with bread, and medieval people were convinced that the body, if left unsupervised, would immediately ruin everything. That's where food morality came in. Foods were believed to shape behavior. Eat the wrong thing, and you didn't just risk indigestion, you risked becoming lazy, lustful, aggressive, or worst of all, content. Contentment was deeply suspicious. Content people didn't strive, they didn't suffer properly, they didn't complain enough, which made it very hard to tell if they were doing religion correctly. So food developed what we might call a moral alignment system. Some foods were humble and safe, others were hot, rich, and spiritually dangerous. This wasn't poetic language. Medieval medicine genuinely taught that food could heat the blood, stir passions, and nudge you toward poor life choices. Basically, dinner could ruin your personality, because nobody could agree exactly where the danger line was. The safest option became constant low-level guilt. You were supposed to eat, but not enjoy it. Eat slowly, eat modestly, eat like someone who could walk away at any moment, even if you absolutely could not. Smiling while eating was risky. Asking for seconds was bold. Commenting that the food was really good today was practically flirting with gluttony. The ideal medieval diner looked mildly disappointed at all times. The real irony is that medieval food was usually bland, repetitive, and sometimes alarming in texture, and yet people were still warned not to like it too much. Imagine feeling sinful over lukewarm porridge. Medieval life found a way. So before we get into which foods were secretly considered sinful, remember this. In the Middle Ages, the greatest culinary crime wasn't excess, it was enjoying yourself and not apologizing for it. When medieval people talked about gluttony, they weren't picturing someone eating until they physically couldn't move. That idea is very modern. Medieval gluttony was far more subtle and far more stressful. It wasn't about how much you ate, it was about how much you liked it. You could eat a perfectly reasonable portion and still sin spectacularly if you did it with the wrong attitude. Eating quickly was a problem. Eating slowly was also a problem. Eating with visible enthusiasm? Absolutely not. You were supposed to consume food the way you accepted suffering, politely, quietly, and without visible joy. Theologians loved listing the many ways gluttony could sneak up on you: eating too early, eating too late, eating too often, eating food that was too tasty, eating food prepared too carefully, eating with anticipation, eating because you wanted to instead of because you had to. If you're noticing a pattern here, yes, eventually just eating at all started to feel risky. In medieval moral thinking, gluttony was about loss of control. Food was dangerous because it bypassed reason. It went straight to the senses. The body enjoyed it before the mind had a chance to intervene, which made it suspicious. Any pleasure that arrived uninvited was immediately assumed to be sinful. This is why restraint became a performance. People ate slowly to demonstrate discipline. They paused between bites, not because they were savoring the food, savoring would have been suspicious, but to show they could stop if they wanted to.
They couldn't, but the appearance mattered. Asking for seconds was bold. Asking for thirds was reckless. Mentioning that you were still hungry suggested a personal failing, possibly a spiritual one. Hunger was acceptable. Satisfaction was dangerous. Comfort was basically a trap. Ironically, this made food more tempting, not less. When you're told something is morally risky, your brain immediately becomes very interested in it. A simple bowl of stew turned into a test of willpower. Bread wasn't just bread, it was a situation. And the worst part? You were expected to monitor yourself constantly. No one needed to catch you overeating. You were supposed to catch yourself enjoying it and feel bad immediately, ideally before swallowing. Gluttony, in medieval terms, wasn't a lack of moderation. It was a moment when you forgot to feel guilty, and the body won. If medieval moral thinkers had to rank foods by how quickly they could ruin a person, meat would have been at the top of the list, underlined twice with a concerned note in the margin. Meat wasn't dangerous because it was rare or forbidden. It was dangerous because it worked. It satisfied hunger too well, and that alone made it deeply suspicious. Red meat, especially beef and pork, was believed to heat the blood, stir the passions, and weaken self-control. Eat too much of it and you weren't just full, you were allegedly more aggressive, more lustful, lazier, and generally closer to becoming the kind of person medieval sermons were specifically written to warn against. In short, dinner could quietly ruin your personality. This is why medieval calendars were packed with meat-free days, Fridays, fasting days, vigils, Lent, saints' days. If the church could find a reason to ban meat, they absolutely would. Medieval people spent a shocking amount of time checking calendars to see whether enjoying dinner today would be morally acceptable or a small step toward damnation. And yet, meat remained incredibly desirable. It was filling, it tasted good, it made hard labor survivable, which only made it more suspicious. Wanting meat too much was already flirting with gluttony, and enjoying it openly suggested a worrying lack of spiritual discipline. The solution: replace meat with fish. Fish was considered cold, damp, and emotionally unambitious, the exact qualities medieval thinkers wanted in food. It didn't inflame the blood, it didn't stir passions, it didn't inspire poetry. Perfect. That's why fish became the official loophole food. On fasting days, when meat was banned, fish slid through the rules with the quiet confidence of something nobody was excited about. Technically not meat. Theologically acceptable, morally boring. Fish was the food equivalent of a beige wall, except unfortunately for everyone involved, fish could be made delicious. Medieval cooks were no fools. Given enough herbs, oil, sauces, and clever preparation, fish stopped being a punishment and started becoming enjoyable. And the moment fish became enjoyable, it immediately became suspicious. A food designed to enforce restraint was now providing pleasure, which completely defeated its spiritual purpose. This created a subtle moral panic. Fish was allowed, but you weren't supposed to like it too much. Simple preparations were safest: boiled fish, plain fish, fish that reminded you emotionally that this was a fasting day and happiness was postponed. If your fish arrived swimming in sauce, dripping with oil, and seasoned with enthusiasm, people began to wonder if you were technically obeying the rules while spiritually cheating. Elite households pushed this loophole to its limits. Lavish fish feasts appeared on fasting days, complete with multiple courses, rich flavors, and elaborate presentations. Technically legal, spiritually questionable. Everyone involved knew what was happening, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Even monasteries struggled. Fish ponds were common, ensuring monks could follow the letter of the law without ever feeling particularly deprived. The fish was fresh, the preparation was careful, the enjoyment was politely ignored. Fish became a symbol of medieval moral flexibility. You could obey the rules while quietly undermining their intent. You could fast without suffering too much. You could appear disciplined while still eating very well. And that was the real issue. Medieval morality wasn't just about what you ate. It was about whether you suffered appropriately while eating it. Fish was allowed because it was supposed to be dull. The moment it wasn't, it became a problem. Cheese may look harmless to us, friendly, comforting, deeply unserious, but medieval moral thinkers regarded it with the same suspicion normally reserved for bad ideas and strong opinions. Cheese was rich, cheese was filling, cheese was enjoyable in a way that lingered, and anything that lingered was immediately morally questionable. Unlike meat, cheese didn't excite the blood in dramatic ways. It did something far worse. It soothed, it comforted, it made people feel content. And contentment in medieval spirituality was a dangerous state. Content people didn't strive, they didn't suffer properly, they didn't complain enough, which made it very hard to tell if they were doing religion correctly. So cheese developed what we might call a moral alignment system. Some cheeses were humble and safe, others were hot, rich, and spiritually dangerous. This wasn't poetic language. Medieval medicine genuinely taught that food could heat the blood, stir passion.
In medieval Europe, even spreading something on bread required spiritual awareness and possibly paperwork. Alcohol held one of the most confusing moral positions in medieval life. On the one hand, it was normal, necessary even. On the other hand, it was constantly one sip away from becoming sinful. Wine and beer were everyday staples, safer than water and easier to trust than most people. But medieval morality insisted that enjoyment had limits, and alcohol was very good at testing them. Beer and wine were considered nourishment. They provided calories, warmth, and comfort. Monks drink beer. Nuns drank wine. Children drank watered-down versions. Nobody pretended abstinence was realistic. Alcohol was part of life, and medieval thinkers accepted that cautiously. The problem began when drinking stopped being practical and started being fun. Moderate drinking was fine. Cheerful drinking was questionable. Loud drinking was dangerous. Drinking for the sake of joy rather than thirst, health, or social obligation crossed into morally unstable territory. The moment alcohol shifted from necessary to enjoyable, suspicion followed closely behind. Drunkenness, in particular, was deeply frowned upon, not because it harmed the body, medieval medicine had seen worse, but because it loosened control. A drunk person laughed too freely, spoke too honestly, forgot restraint, and forgetting restraint was always the real fear. Medieval sermons warned constantly about taverns. Taverns were places where drinking happened without supervision, where laughter got loud, and where people forgot to feel guilty at appropriate intervals. Taverns weren't sinful by default, they were just environments where sin could stretch its legs. Interestingly, monks were allowed a surprising amount of alcohol. The justification was simple. Monks worked hard, lived disciplined lives, and deserved a little liquid comfort. This logic did not extend to peasants who were expected to suffer more quietly. The moral line was never clearly drawn. How much was too much? How cheerful was too cheerful? At what point did relaxed become sinful? No one could say, which meant everyone had to guess constantly. The safest way to drink was carefully, slowly, without celebration, preferably while reminding yourself that you were drinking for health, not happiness. Laughing too hard over wine was a bad look, singing was worse, dancing was almost certainly a problem. Alcohol wasn't condemned because it existed, it was condemned because it worked. It made life easier, warmer, and occasionally joyful, and medieval morality never fully trusted joy, especially when it came in a cup. In medieval Europe, eating alone wasn't just lonely, it was suspicious, deeply suspicious. Food was meant to be shared, witnessed, and quietly judged by others. A meal eaten in private raised uncomfortable questions, mostly along the lines of, "What are you enjoying so much that you don't want anyone to see it?" Communal eating served a moral function. When you ate with others, your behavior was visible, your portions were observed, your enthusiasm was moderated. Someone could see if you reached for too much, chewed too eagerly, or looked a little too pleased with yourself. Accountability, medieval style. Eating alone removed all of that. No witnesses, no gentle judgment, no one to clear their throat meaningfully if you seemed to be enjoying the bread a bit too much. And in a culture that equated pleasure with risk, that lack of supervision was unsettling.
Private eating suggested secrecy, and secrecy suggested indulgence, and indulgence suggested sin. The logic wasn't subtle, but it was effective. Monastic rules were especially strict about this. Monks were expected to eat together, often in silence, listening to religious readings while consuming food that was deliberately plain. Eating alone meant you were focusing on the meal instead of your soul, which was clearly unacceptable. Even thinking about food too much during meals was frowned upon. Eating was supposed to be efficient, not engaging. Among lay people, the expectation was looser, but still present. Meals were social events, family rituals, community moments. Eating by yourself implied you were either hiding something or had lost control of your discipline. Neither option reflected well on your spiritual health. Snacking was particularly problematic. There was something unsettling about eating outside designated mealtimes. It suggested impulse, desire, lack of restraint. A person who ate whenever they wanted was a person not fully governed by moral structure, and that was dangerous. Of course, people still ate. They snuck food. They justified it. They pretended it didn't count, but the guilt lingered. A private meal came with a side of internal commentary, questioning whether this was necessary, appropriate, or spiritually unwise. Eating together kept people honest. Eating alone made enjoyment too easy, and easy enjoyment in medieval thinking was rarely innocent. So if medieval people insisted on sharing meals, it wasn't just for company, it was surveillance, politely disguised as dinner. In medieval Europe, food wasn't judged only by what it was judged by when it was eaten. The calendar mattered more than the ingredients. A perfectly acceptable meal could turn sinful overnight simply because the date changed. Midnight didn't just reset the day, it reset morality. The church calendar was dense. Fasting days, feast days, vigils, saints' days, holy seasons. It was a full-time moral scheduling system. Meat on the wrong day? Sin. Dairy at the wrong hour? Questionable. Eggs when you technically shouldn't? Spiritually awkward. The food itself didn't change, the rules did. This meant medieval people lived in a constant state of low-level culinary anxiety. Before eating, you didn't ask, "Am I hungry?" You asked, "What day is it?" And sometimes, "What time is it?" Because eating before certain prayers or after certain bells could also be morally significant. Hunger was allowed, bad timing was not. People genuinely worried about accidental sin. Imagine biting into something, enjoying it for half a second, and then realizing it was a fasting day. That moment of realization carried real emotional weight. People confessed these mistakes, apologized for them, lost sleep over them. Somewhere, a medieval priest was listening patiently to someone explain how a sausage betrayed them spiritually. What made this worse was inconsistency. Different regions followed different rules. What was allowed in one town might be questionable in the next. Monasteries had their own interpretations, bishops had opinions, local priests had moods, and God presumably was expected to keep track of all of this without issuing a clear instruction manual. The result was cautious eating. People avoided certain foods just in case. They ate plainer meals on ambiguous days. They justified questionable bites with quick prayers. If something tasted too good, people often paused, not to savor it, but to make sure it was legally acceptable at that moment in time. Food timing became a moral minefield. You could eat the same meal 2 days in a row and be virtuous one day and sinful the next. Consistency was impossible, certainty was rare, and guilt was abundant. In medieval life, it wasn't enough to eat correctly, you had to eat on schedule, and heaven help you if you forgot what day it was. By this point, it should be clear that medieval food rules were never really about nutrition, health, or even obedience for its own sake. They were about control. Control over the body, control over desire, control over the terrifying possibility that people might enjoy something without immediately feeling bad about it. Medieval thinkers believed the body was unreliable, dangerous even. Left unchecked, it would eat too much, drink too freely, sleep too long, and eventually start asking inconvenient questions. Food was one of the body's most effective tools, not because it was sinful, but because it was persuasive. Hunger was useful. Hunger made people humble. Hunger made them obedient. Hunger reminded them that life was hard and salvation was elsewhere. Satisfaction, on the other hand, made people relaxed, and relaxed people stopped paying attention. They laughed, they lingered, they forgot themselves. That forgetfulness was the real threat. This is why so many rules focused not on banning food outright, but on limiting enjoyment. You could eat, but not eagerly. You could drink, but not cheerfully. You could season your food, but not enthusiastically. Every pleasure had to be restrained, justified, or ideally accompanied by guilt. The body enjoying itself meant the soul wasn't in charge, and medieval morality was deeply invested in hierarchy, including the hierarchy inside your own skin. The soul was supposed to rule, the body was supposed to obey. Food complicated that relationship by making obedience inconvenient. What terrified medieval moral authorities wasn't excess alone, it was momentum. Pleasure had a habit of spreading. Enjoy food today, drink tomorrow, enjoy comfort the next day, and suddenly you weren't suffering enough. Suffering was productive, comfort was not. So food became regulated not because it was evil, but because it worked too well. It softened edges, it distracted from prayer, it made the present moment bearable, which medieval theology considered suspiciously close to forgetting eternity. In a strange way, medieval food rules reveal a deep anxiety about human nature. They assumed people needed constant boundaries to remain virtuous. Remove the boundaries, even briefly, and everything might unravel, starting with dinner.